10x your service design offering with Smapply. Take 20% off any order with This Is HCD 20 off. Let's superpower you and your design team's potential. Sign up at smapply.app. Enjoy the episode from your friends at Smapply, helping support This Is HCD podcast.
Hi and welcome to episode 4 of the Decoding Culture podcast on This Is HCD. The podcast focuses on the importance that culture plays in all areas of business and society, from how it shapes organizations and teams to how it influences consumer experience, design and larger societal trends. My name is John Curran and I'm your host. I'm a business anthropologist, executive coach and facilitator, and CEO of JC & Associates, which is a consultancy that explores how culture shapes organizations and consumer behavior. As a business anthropologist, I often find my eyes are running through the business sections of large bookstores to try and piece together the cultural trends that are shaping business thinking today. Leadership is the clear front runner here, but why is this so? To help me navigate this question, I sat down with journalist and author Stefan Stern. Stefan has been writing about management and leadership for over 20 years. He regularly writes in the Financial Times, The Guardian, and other business publications. He is visiting professor in management practice at CAS Business School, and he has also written 2 business books. The first one is Myths of Management, or What People Get Wrong About Being the Boss. He co-authored this with Professor Gerry Cooper, and recently his second book has come out called How to Be a Better Leader. In this episode, Stefan and I explore the current trends in thinking around leadership. What makes a good leader? And of course, what are some of the pitfalls of being a leader? We discuss themes such as purpose in leadership, the importance of developing values. Here, Stefan offers a brilliant example of how independent bookstores use values to counter the threat of big companies like Amazon. He also provides an interesting take on placing Winston Churchill as the numero uno figure of what good leadership is. You can also find out where Stefan will be taking his anthropologist's notebook and why. So enjoy this episode. So Stefan, welcome to Decoding Culture podcast.
Very nice to be here, John. Thank you.
Fantastic. Well, we're sitting in an apartment, my apartment in Crystal Palace, South London. So we feel that we're grounded here. So it's,
well, I'm South London born and bred, so I haven't got very far from home today.
I know. We know each other's turfs, as we say. So we're going to be talking about leadership. And one of the kind of big questions, or the opening questions I wanted to say is, well, why leadership? Why are you writing about leadership?
Well, I write about leadership and management, and we can sort of discuss later how different those things are or not. I think leadership is a timeless topic. We're always interested in who's in charge, what direction are we going in. We always have views about our leaders, and some of us actually want to be leaders. Some of us feel we are natural born leaders, or our places out front or up top. So it's a timeless, a permanent topic of interest. And leadership undoubtedly matters, although, of course, what I'm interested in is the extent to which sometimes we maybe overemphasize or exaggerate the importance of leadership, or worship the wrong leaders, or see what bad leadership can do to us. So on many levels, it's a topic that I just find kind of endlessly interesting.
It's quite interesting, though, if you go to big bookstores, or you go to the airport bookshop or big train station bookshops, in the business shelves of books, it's kind of bombarded with leadership stuff, right? Mm-hmm. And you go into LinkedIn, there's mindfulness and leadership, there's leadership and leadership, there's this type of leadership. Are we seeing a kind of cultural shift in how leadership is kind of packaged up, how we're made to think about it?
I think it's perhaps more cyclical than a linear shift. I think things come and go in and out of fashion because of history, because of politics or the economic cycle. And different types of leadership are fashionable at different moments. You've got the whole media. Obviously, I'm a journalist, so I'm obsessed with the media impact of the stories that we tell about successes and failures. Myths often, false, almost fairy tale versions of what's really happened. Mm-hmm. Post hoc rationalizations of leadership, which are actually nothing like what was really going on at the time. But we live off the myths and prefer that. So I don't know if there's a permanent shift, for example, in one direction, but I think there are cycles and fashions and more of a pendulum swing maybe of what comes in and out of fashion.
Okay, so but in your book that came out less than a year ago, how to be a better leader, and I'll say a little bit more about that later, because we do have a copy for one of our listeners, but it's always bad to quote the first page of a book because it looks like that's all I've read, and I'm sure you have read the whole thing. However, there is a striking quote of yours in there, and it does say that leadership is in crisis.
Yes.
Can you tell us why?
Of course, that is partly a dramatic scene setting to try and get people to go beyond the first page.
Yeah, okay.
Maybe it worked with you, I don't know. I think, well, I suppose going back to that literal meaning of crisis, as in, a point where we've got to make a choice between perhaps one of many different paths. I think it's also in crisis, though, because of the deep, deep skepticism, not to say cynicism, that so many of us have about leaders. I mean, it's the flip side, or the double-edged nature of transparency, that we all kind of think in principle that we approve of transparency, but that does mean seeing almost everything, seeing a lot more that we perhaps didn't used to see, and we see leaders up close in real time, and we're not always convinced that they're doing a terribly good job. We've had, of course, great financial, economic crisis in the past decade. The politics are also shifting, the rise of populism, and that's a kind of simple solution leadership that some people are offering. So I would say crisis in the sense of what's the right way to go? What is the model? What is the approach that works now? And also there's another point about leadership, that it does have to adapt to the circumstances that we're in. But I think the part of the crisis that I'm trying to describe is that deep skepticism, not to say cynicism, about people at the top. And do they really do the authority figures, supposed, actually have much authority left?
But who's actually questioning that then? I mean, if we as this kind of collective are looking at leaders and beginning to question them, who are the we? I mean, who are questioning leaders?
I think it's we in different contexts. So it's we as employees, we as in families or community groups, we as voters, we as sports fans, we as cultural critics or consumers of culture. So any leadership job, if it's the guy running the National Theatre, running art galleries, or the BBC, what's the story again and again is, the leadership, and the big touch. And what we need around here is leadership, people say. And then you ask them, what do you mean? And some people mean, I want a very confident, assertive person to tell me what to do. Very old-fashioned view of leadership. But that's what some people think they want until they get told to do something they don't want to do. And then they have to wrestle with, well, is that actually the model of leadership that's really going to work for me?
Sometimes, or often as an anthropologist, I'm asked the question, well, what is culture? Right?
Yes.
And I go, well. So if I said, well, what actually then is leadership?
Okay.
I mean, maybe you do have a succinct definition, but how would you describe it?
Well, I think this is where the adjectives come in a way, because, there are versions of leadership. So there's something called classically command and control leadership, which is essentially directing and telling people pretty much what you want specifically. And of course, in certain circumstances, that might be necessary and it might be the right way to go. People think that's somehow military. They feel it's sort of almost they're in a uniform, command and control. You go to Sandhurst, where the British Army leaders are trained, and it turns out they don't really believe in command and control leadership at all. Certainly not in theatre, in war. They want everyone to display leadership. They want everyone to be able to step up in case the colonel or the boss gets a bullet through the head in the first few moments of conflict. But anyway, that's one classic version of leadership. But then there are more kind of collaborative versions. There's distributed leadership, where you actually delegate and you share leadership among several people. There's so-called servant leadership, where you're more humble, where you're kind of offering to serve. And indeed, at Sandhurst, over the gates there, it says serve to lead.
Okay.
So I think the word leadership alone requires unpacking, as you're asking me to, sometimes with labels, sometimes with adjectives. Of course, crudely, narrowly, you might say it's something about setting direction, setting the direction of travel for a group of people, and maybe setting some goals and targets. And another fashionable word that's coming through a lot at the moment is purpose. So maybe a leader has something to do with explaining what the point is of what you're doing, and in that sense becoming something of a storyteller.
So that's really interesting. I think we kind of then, that storyteller part of leadership kind of comes into this anthropological space as well. Sure. But I've heard things about a leader should be able to tell stories because the facts, the message sit within stories rather than just bullet points.
Yes.
So there's something.
And there we're getting into one of the distinctions between leadership and management. And we can talk about this a bit more if you like. On the whole, my bias, if you like, is that we overemphasize the difference between leadership and management, and the fact that they're blurred and they're not that different. But one difference you could say is that managers are more in that sort of bullet point task completion world, whereas leaders are perhaps telling a bigger picture and a bigger story, which is the thing about direction and purpose and why we're here, which is not a bullet point.
So I've got this image then of a leader in a nice kind of swivel Eames chair, kind of rocking back.
It's the dream.
Thinking about purpose and vision.
Yes.
And then they've got these managers maybe standing around there with a kind of clipboard ready to go. And
yes, that's right. And that's the fun. That's nice. And it's a nice sort of caricature in a way. But you can immediately see the danger in that. Where leaders say grandly, perhaps if they're sort of rather narcissistic, oh, I'm strictly big picture. Don't come to me with the little stuff. That's for you guys. That's for managers.
Right.
I am a leader. I'm out, capital L, and I'm out top and I'm out front, and I've got big ideas. And you, the little people, have to try and make it work. See, I think that this is a very terrible version of leadership, which is detached. But equally, the manager who just says, well, I'm heads down, or don't give me the don't give me a big picture. Just give me what's the target for the week, and I'll hit it, and I'll get this done by Friday. And I just manage. I'm not a leader. What I'm building up to saying is that really, ideally, and this is where the word boss is quite useful. Actually, you really need bosses who kind of are able to provide leadership and are able to manage. Would you want to work for a leader who can't manage, and do you want to work for a manager who can't lead? And the answer is no to both. Now, it's asking a lot of a human being to be capable of both these things. But my fear is that when we overemphasize the distinction between leadership and management, we kind of let people off the hook, and we say to them, okay, well, okay, Dave, you're a leader, and Shirley, you're a manager, and stick to what you're good at, and we won't ask any more of you, and that's probably not quite good enough.
So then, what are some of the consequences then of that? If we had Dave as leader and Shirley as manager, and we went back to go and see what the organizational culture was like a year later, what are some of the issues we might be seeing with that type of model?
Well, I think in Shirley's team, and I'm sorry I picked the gender in that order, but anyway, let's go with it. In Shirley's team, there are going to be a lot of people saying, well, why are we doing this? Okay, you've given this a target. Okay, you said 4:00 Thursday, this is going to be done, but I don't. Why? Why should I be working hard to do this? And meanwhile, Dave, in his lovely chair, in his executive office there, is completely out of touch, and he has no idea what's happening on the shop floor or where the real work is happening, and he's full of his dreams of leadership and this wonderful self-created notion of himself as playing the role of a leader, and actually he's absolutely detached from the reality of the work that has to be done. And in the end, this does all have to come back to, as Peter Drucker said, good ideas have to degenerate into work.
Yes,
and it's about task completion. And so while I've written about leadership, I've also written about management, my first book, and I like to write about both because you can't have one without the other. And when leadership is detached from the real necessarily messy business of work and task completion, something's gone wrong.
Okay, so this kind of, we're going to get back to some other stuff, but this leads on to this idea of what makes, and you write about this in the book, you write both, what makes a good and what makes a bad leader. Yeah. But this idea then of, it sounds like there's a kind of fine balance between being a leader but having elements of the management as well. What makes a good leader then? What are some of the characteristics we should be looking at?
So I'm giving you the answer to that in 2020, and 5 years from now, the answer might sound slightly different depending on the context. I think that's my first point. A good leader is effective in a given context in an organization and at a moment in time. So today, the answer is good leaders are good listeners. They are sensitive to the world around them and to the organization that they're leading. but they're also clear-sighted
Okay.
and purposeful, and they do set a direction. They do have confidence, and that can even be arrogance. I'm not saying leaders have to be sheepish, humble. In the Jim Collins Good to Great world, he talks about level 5 leaders who are essentially rather low ego, modest people who don't make it. And I know exactly what he's getting at. It's a very good point that you are there to serve the organization. It's not about you as the leader. It's about everybody else and about also what you leave behind when you're finished. But I don't mind well-founded arrogance in a leader who's really good and is leading an organization that's thriving. You should feel confident about that. You should feel good about that.
Okay, well-founded arrogance. Yeah. There is one image of that, which might be, I'm going to listen to you, and I'll always listen to you, but then you will agree that I'm right, which is the Brian Clough,
yes.
the football manager approach. Yes. But arrogance being able to shout, being able to say, this is how it's going to happen, tough.
I'm slightly exaggerating to make the point, but I'm just saying that confidence and even slight overconfidence is not a bad thing, because, optimism and what's sometimes called can do is very important. We don't want to work for pessimists. And you can tip into that a little bit if you overemphasize the sort of the modesty, humility, low ego stuff. Suddenly there's no presence, and you don't have to be charismatic. It probably helps a bit. It's not the main game in town of leadership is charisma. I wouldn't agonize about it, but it can help. And confidence encourages people, and that's another thing I think a leader has to do. You have to encourage people.
This idea of charisma, I think you've picked up on, because that's something. Charisma, from anthropological theory of Papua New Guinea and
yes.
The famous anthropologist and economic anthropologist Marshall Sahlins talks about big man theory, and it's all about getting a following.
Yes.
Getting people admiring you and then rewarding them back with financial good and lavish parties. But there's always the potential that there's a younger big man ready to topple you.
Of course.
But how far do we take charisma? How does charisma lean into narcissism? Does it, and this is, I guess, everything feels like a balancing act.
Yes, trade-offs, absolutely right. It is a trade-off. And journalistically, we might be tempted to say that something is either correct or wrong, and that there's a right way and a wrong way, and actually there's more of a spectrum and a balancing act. So I don't totally belittle charisma, but again, I don't over egg it. Jim Collins again said, well, he said to me when I interviewed him, charisma isn't data and it's not results. It's not really a substantial thing. He said charisma is irrelevant. I might not quite go that far myself. I think it can help. But the thing about charisma is, when a leader leaves the room, do you remember? Does their personality actually resonate? Do you remember what they said? Or do you just say, what was all that noise about? And so there's a risk that with charisma, it is just noise that kind of makes you feel quite good at the time, but doesn't do anything that lasts and doesn't resonate after you've left the room. That's what you want to guard against.
There's something else. I think it was also really interesting what I've kind of certainly noticed with my own work, but also just generally the kind of cultural landscape. There different types, right? There's leaders of corporations, there's leaders of government or charity bodies, and then what we see a lot of, especially in the literature and books, is the kind of startup leader. And it seems to all merge into one. And work I do with some organizations, there's the kind of leader being the founder. And with a growing company, that can cause some interesting challenges. And it's an interesting thing about leader as founder. And how would a founder leader be helped to maybe develop?
Well, this is the context point, because there's a certain type of leadership that might really be absolutely necessary in that startup phase, which is about total commitment and the long hours culture and being quite hard on yourself, but also, of course, resilience as things go wrong again and again, and you maybe run out of money or very nearly do, and so on. But clearly, that feels almost like crisis management. That's clearly not what you want once a business has been through one or two cycles, has been funded, is established. You can't run in permanent crisis. Adaptation, yes, but not crisis. And so that founder leader has got to decide, and needs good advisors, really, and good friends to tell him or her, you've finished your job here.
Okay.
Go and start something else, because you are a founder, but you're an entrepreneur, but you are not the sort of steady state incremental growth leader. That's a different sort of person. Very difficult for someone to be all these different things and have that adaptability and versatility to behave in very different ways at different times in the life cycle of a business. I'm sure some can do it, but not many of us can.
But that's a massive thing, isn't it? For someone to be able to say to you, maybe it's time you move on.
Yeah.
You've done great. Yeah. You're not going to be a pauper. But the emotional attachment that's played out, often that becomes, if anything, the toxic.
If your name's on the door, if it's your baby, that's hard. But, it could be that your work is done, and the legacy, the true legacy, is other people picking up what you've built and doing more with it, because that's the appropriate leadership for that moment. And task completion is a good thing, and good consultants do some work with a client and then can move on. The client can, knowledge is transferred, skills and capabilities are transferred, and the client can move on. They're not addicted to the consultant. And it's the same with leaders. We can't be addicted to a leader, because what happens when the leader goes? Like a family where the pater familias dies and things crumble, well, the legacy has not been prepared for properly. So leaders should always be thinking about what happens to this place when I'm dead, when I've gone.
It's almost like the psychoanalysis Bowlby talking about attachment theory. Good attachment, but also good detachment.
Yes.
About how exactly. the child leaving the house. How do you, this idea of legacy? You brought it up. That's really interesting. Is it, legacy? I think sometimes people get confused. It's about legacy isn't about how many trophies are there in the cabinet. It's about actually what's going to happen when I've gone. And is that something that actually leaders should be coached in? Is what is the legacy you would like to have? Indeed. And that's what you would need to be. That would serve both company and also the individual.
Some people will tell you that it's almost a day one thought, a day one task. We know in public companies, quoted companies, the leader may only get 3 or 4 years. It's really not very long in the history of a company or organization that you hope is going to be around for decades to come.
Yeah.
So clearly you need to be, it's in Stephen Covey, of course, one of the 7 habits of highly effective people is start with the end in mind. And, or as the Romans used to say, respice finem. You've got to think about the ending, your departure. Right. And what you're really trying to achieve, because we are only here for a limited amount of time, whether it's 3 or 4 years as CEO or in a human life expectancy. And that's where purpose helps, because it's the answer to the purpose question in a way, is when I've finished here, what will it look like, and how will they be set up for the future?
How does that work, though, if you mentioned the term earlier. I saw it on the BBC a couple of nights ago with the Labour Party and the leadership debate around what one of the candidates, Keir Starmer, talked about collaborative leadership.
Yes.
And I was thinking, well, does that mean lots of Post-it notes? Does that mean Sharpie pens? And, we've got a big design audience who listen to this.
Yeah.
And the word collaboration sounds really sexy and egalitarian. But how do I think about my legacy and me as a leader if we're talking about collaboration in that way? I mean, is there a tension that...
I think that's another trade-off, because, as I say, you've got to be confident. There's a degree of vanity or arrogance, narcissism is helpful in leaders. Michael Maccabee has written about, constructive narcissists.
Right.
And he doesn't regard narcissist as a wholly pejorative term. You've got to have some idea about yourself. You've got to think that you've got something to contribute. It takes a degree of that arrogance, if you like, to put yourself forward as a leader. But yes, equally, the collaboration point is, I don't know everything. One of the myths that we tell about leaders is that they're these heroic, lonely figures. And we say it's lonely at the top. But it shouldn't be completely lonely at the top, because you should always be listening to people, and you should always have some trusted advisors. I know there's business confidentiality and so on, and you can't necessarily be completely candid about everything. But actually, a friend of mine from Cass Business School, Laura Empson, whose specialism is professional service firms, always says, if you're lonely at the top, you're doing it wrong, because you should be talking to people and listening to people. But collaboration is drawing on the gifts, the talents, the ideas of other people, not being so arrogant that you think that you know everything.
That's really important, because actually that you write about this as well in the book, but the learning culture model, which Microsoft have done so well at. So it started with the leader.
Yes.
As a focus, as a purpose.
Yes.
But actually it's resonated throughout the whole company.
Yes.
As this importance to be able to learn,
Yes.
listen, all these type of... You talk about purpose, you also talk about values.
Oh, yes.
Now, my gripe with values is when I go into organizations and I start doing what I call a cultural audit.
Yes.
I see values as things that exist on walls, as statements, or in nice pamphlets and marketing communications, and they're kind of ideological. They sound nice, but actually they haven't got much oomph behind them.
Yes. And is there also a problem that it's not clear from the list of values what the business actually does? I mean, this is a problem with mission statements and values, that are sort of almost generic or non-specific, because I think, well, you tell me, but I think if a culture is vibrant and vital, and if values are being lived in that sense, then they should strike people who are there as meaningful and relevant to the experience of their day-to-day working life. A value that's imposed from outside because a CEO or his or her advisor say, "Oh, we've got to say something about integrity."
Yes.
You know, if you actually, meanwhile, in the business, it's a pretty cutthroat, rough business where corners are being cut and difficult ethical trade-offs are being made. To talk to everyone about integrity, it's just going to sound completely false.
I think that's a great point. It's often, I think, where you see values work is when it actually goes into the nitty-gritty, the DNA of the everyday culture. Right. So how do we run our meetings? What do our KPIs look like?
Yes.
You know, the hard... Not the hard everyday stuff, not just the once a year reviewing our values.
And you would probably talk about the artifacts of the workplace, right? In parking spaces,
exactly.
How clean are the toilets?
Yeah,
you know, I mean, you can't talk about our people are our biggest asset. Oh, but don't go to the loo because you'll be sick.
Yeah.
You know? It's like these contrasts, aren't sustainable.
There's a great example I want to explore a bit. I think it was, firstly, you mentioned ethnography in the book, which is superb. Professor Ryan Ravielli from Harvard Business School did a big study on independent bookshops and where values came into their narrative and how they worked as a means of almost like a counter to Amazon. Can you tell me a bit about that story?
Well, he talks about this building of community and curating and convening. He's 3 C's, and we could add a 4th C, which is care, which I think is kind of implicit in all that. And it's just trying to say it's kind of your sweet spot in a way, because it's where culture and business models collide, but to productive effect. Because he's saying that we're only going to survive here if we are different. We can't be this mass thing. We've got to reinstate the human factor and let people know that we are real people, that this is a community, that it's worth sticking with us. And then we're going to convene it, as he says, and curate it. But we actually care, And I think that's a very interesting word, care, as a noun and a verb. And it's something that leaders need to transmit. They need to show that they genuinely, the genuinely is silent, genuinely care. It's a much abused word. If you look at the state of social care, for example, something that we call care is actually minimal and not human. And I think what he spotted with these bookshops is that they care. It's a business, but they genuinely care.
But they care about the community, and then am I right in thinking they become also then part of the fabric of community?
Embedded.
Yes. So it becomes reciprocal. The relationship between customer and...
And people touch on this when they talk about customer experience, but meaningful customer experience is more like what you're describing, where you go there to shop. You might not buy anything on that occasion, but you go there because it's a place that you recognize that means something to you, that has embedded with values that are your values, that you share, that you feel part of. And as you know, some people talk about participatory consumerism, where you're not just passively accepting something or buying something in a thoughtless way, but there is an experience. And if high streets are going to survive, shop and retail's going to survive, there's got to be more than just the Amazon minimal experience, which is ultra efficient and price competitive. The physical shop has got to give us something more than that. I'm hoping, and that's why I wanted to focus on that, because I'm hoping to be doing a
a pod issue with an independent bookstore around how he goes around the Amazon challenge locally here in Crystal Palace. So, so this is going to be fantastic. What with my kind of cultural analysis hat on, reading a lot of stuff around leadership in books, but also on LinkedIn and talks on TED, and I find this kind of cultural trend where often the focus is on leaders of companies and business. But as an example, it seems to kind of flip into this idea of, right, we're going to use politicians as an example here, or famous sports coaches or managers like Sir Alex Ferguson of Manchester United, or, you know, as a leader. Why do we see that? Why do we see that kind of need to look at politicians or look at sports coaches as this kind of...
I suppose it's partly an availability bias, I think you would call it, because they're there and we see them all the time. I mean, I'm very struck by, I'm sorry to talk about football because there's a bit sort of gender stereotyping maybe going on here, but in the TV coverage of football, as you know, or soccer to our American friends, the camera shows the manager at the side of the pitch a hell of a lot. The reaction shots, the emotions, the gestures, and all that kind of visual vocabulary of how the manager. But actually, in the football match, there's 2 halves of 45 minutes each. What is the manager doing? The manager isn't on the pitch. This is my point about work and task completion. In terms of work, the work is on the pitch, and it's the staff, the people, the players who are doing the work. I mean, the manager's reaction is theatre. Of course, that he, if it is a male boss, is trying to convey something across the white line of the pitch to the team. But and that sums up in a way for me the way that we sometimes over-exaggerate the lead at the expense of the team and the work that's being done. But yes, we love sports coaches, we love politicians. It seems to me there's something interesting and actually pretty dangerous going on at the moment as far as political leaders are concerned, and this rise of populism, which there's absolute divergence between what a lot of us have been saying and thinking about leadership and management for 30 years now, about collaboration, about facilitation, listening, and moving away from command and control in the workplace, broadly. And meanwhile, in politics, we see highly authoritarian, even dictatorial populist leaders laying down the law, breaking norms of behavior in terms of truth-telling and morality and social and conduct and so on. And those are the leaders who are having a big impact on our lives. And of course, as you say, those are the leaders we focus on an enormous amount. So as someone who's interested in leadership and has written about it, I am troubled, to say the least, by this phenomenon of the really rather demagogic populist leaders in the realm of politics, because it's a very direct challenge to almost everything I've written about for almost 3 decades.
But if I was to kick back on that, surely we're seeing that as, if that was in business, we'd be talking about innovative leader and, the kind of breaking convention. And, it's the kind of the charismatic leader Max Weber talked about, not going with tradition, not going with rationality. Let's throw the rule book out.
Yes. Well, there's a bit of that, and that is creative in business. And, predictably, I've got to mention someone like Steve Jobs. He looked different, he behaved differently, he created a mystique and an aura, and he's a brilliant marketer apart from anything else about these shiny products that everybody wanted to have. But it is done for a creative purpose in business. What we don't really seem to want anymore in business, not really, are true dictators, forceful or even aggressive command and control people. And corporate governance reform all around the world, over these past 2 or 3 decades, has been all about trying to rein in excessively dominant chief executives, because we worry about what happens to those businesses. I mean, particularly in the financial sector, of course, but also elsewhere, if there is this sort of lone figure calling all the shots. So I say in business, by and large, we've been moving away from that. And meanwhile, on the political stage, people acting very, very crudely, directly. But of course, and here's the challenging bit for me, some voters apparently liking it. Because as I said right at the beginning, to some people, leadership means a very assertive, foghorn-voiced person standing on a table or something, telling you what to do.
Right, it becomes you. In the book, you do mention Winston Churchill.
Yes.
Well, I mean, it's very interesting because I think in the White House in Washington, there's Obama got removed the head of Winston Churchill, and President Trump brought it back in, and he's rolled out as the leader of leaders, right? But you question that in the book.
Yes, because and you'll know from the many biographies, including more recent ones, Church had a long and fascinating, extraordinary life. And between 1940 and 1945, he was the right person at the right time. The leadership he provided between 1940 and 1945 for that period was extraordinary and vital to our freedoms that we can sit here today in London and speak freely. So I do not belittle that in one iota. But the way he acted and behaved between 1940 and 1945 is not necessarily, almost certainly not, the way to behave as a leader at all other times. He had been considered a failure. He'd had lots of disasters in his early political career, lots of misjudgments. And after 1945, it's still quite hard for non-Brits to grasp that in the general election, only a few weeks after both VE Day in May and the final end of the war, in a general election, Churchill was booted out. The Conservative Party was ejected forcefully with a massive landslide victory for modest Mr. Attlee and the Labour Party that was proposing something quite different. And because in a way, if there was any wisdom in the crowd at that point, the voters were saying, thank you very much, Mr. Churchill. The war is over. We're now in a totally different phase of this country's history. We're about rebuilding. And also, by the way, trying to avoid some of the mistakes that maybe led us to the brink of war in the past, and his leadership was no longer required. There's film of Churchill being heckled in Walthamstow, North London, at a greyhound track as he's campaigning in the election of 1945, being heckled just a few weeks after crowds everywhere cheering him for being the saviour of the nation. So in a way, the public arguably made a very sensible choice and distinction between leadership of one period in our history and the leadership that would be needed in another moment. Just as I was saying, the startup, the founder leader may be ideal for a certain time and then no longer what's really wanted.
I'm going to ask you about advice.
Okay.
To imagine if you had to give one bit of advice to kind of a smart person who's entering into this world of leadership, what would this one bit of advice be?
Well, if I cheat and take two, I suppose it's listen and learn, or observe and learn. Because I think you're right, we've been discussing earlier this business of adapting and changing your repertoire of behaviour. I would recommend Eminia Ibarra's work. She's now at London Business School. Her latest book was Act Like a Leader, Think Like a Leader. And I think she makes this point that you're going to have to adapt. If you're stepping up to a leadership role or want to, what got you to a certain position might not be necessary, might not work in a more challenging and exposed position. And interestingly, she talks about this question of authenticity, that you will have to adapt, change the way you do things, maybe in a way that isn't natural to you immediately, that maybe feels slightly inauthentic. Mm-hmm. There's this slightly crude notion of authenticity which says, just be yourself. But that's not quite enough. And as Rob Goffey and Gareth Jones say in their book, Why Should Anyone Be Led by You? You have to be yourself, but more, i.e. draw on the good bits, and then, but with skill. So judge the moment, judge the situation, and learn and observe and listen from what happens, because it's not a finishing line, it's an ongoing task of becoming a better leader. But everyone can do that. Everyone can adapt, and everyone can learn and get better at it. So it might be daunting, but these things are doable.
That's great. Okay. So my final wrap-up question, I ask this to all my guests. I'm going to give you the anthropologist's notebook.
Yes.
And you can take this notebook anywhere for a year-long ethnographic study.
Okay.
Relevant to what we've been talking about.
Yes.
So where do you think you'll take this notebook and go and study with it?
Okay, well, I may have missed the most exciting part of it, the transition, but I would like to hang out with Satya Nadella at Microsoft, as you mentioned earlier, because something pretty remarkable seems to have happened at Microsoft in the past few years, when most of us, all us wise guys in the media and in the business community, said, Microsoft's finished. That's a dying company. I mean, dying very, very slowly, and it's still rich and powerful. But don't look to Microsoft for anything interesting to happen. And they have completely confounded that, and they've shown that there can be sort of second lives even for great corporations. And he has transmitted something. Yes, as a strong leader, but also I think probably in a collaborative way. He has transmitted something to the organisation that really seems to have made something interesting happen there.
And that's something incredible because it's such a big organisation.
Yeah, exactly.
And to get that kind of change is incredible.
Yeah.
Well, I'll be looking forward to your ethnographic anthropologist book that you'll be writing on Microsoft, hopefully in a couple of years. But Stefan, thank you so much, and it's been a pleasure having you as a guest.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to the Decoding Culture podcast. Please do subscribe to it on iTunes and give it a rating. If you want to learn more about other shows and podcasts on This Is HCD Network, visit thisishcd.com, where you can also sign up to the newsletter and join the Slack channel where there's some fantastic conversations happening. Stefan has also kindly provided me with a signed copy of his latest book, How to Be a Better Leader. To receive this free copy, please visit thisishcd.com and sign up to the newsletter. Then email me at john@jcassociateslondon.com and write a short sentence relating to what does leadership mean to you. The best email will receive the book in the post. See you next time.